All right, we're going to get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 33 of This Week is Live. I'm your host, Raymond Flotat from mxdwn.com. That's Mixdown. So glad to see you well. Lots of stuff to talk about and some other interesting stuff. We're a little late going on the air today, but that's because we are simul broadcasting this not only on Twitch like we usually do, but also on Instagram. Some people should be seeing this on Instagram right now as I'm speaking, and then also on Tumblr. This is something we're experimenting with. Not sure if we're going to stick with it, but for now, looks like we're going to go this way. And if it works, we'll continue to do this. This is a different way to reach people in different platforms where they might be. So if you are not already, and if you would prefer to, follow us on Twitch. That's the best experience, main chat room, all of that stuff. That is the best place to see this in terms of its native natural broadcast. But anywhere you are, we're happy to reach you and happy to be speaking with you. So let's get right into it with our stories for the day. First of all, and a very interesting and surprising, this is what it's taken so long to get to this point, kind of news. Tracy Chapman, who was a famous singer behind the hit single Fast Car and Give Me One Reason to Stay Here in the late 80s, early 90s, has found herself with a new accolade many, many, many years past the point that many of her hits came, which is that she is the first Black woman as a sole songwriter to be number one on the country charts as a songwriter because the artist Luke Combs covered her song, and it is a massive runaway hit, just like it was when she originally recorded it herself in the early 80s, or excuse me, late 80s, 1988. So congratulations to Tracy Chapman, and, surprising that that barrier took this long to break as far as what country is. Even country music is being evocative of people in the South, rural communities, and other places across America, but surprisingly it took this long to get to that point. Also, some of you might remember a couple years ago when Little Nas X came out with his famed song Old Town Road, that there was something of a controversy about that song being on the country chart, since it was kind of a country song, but also kind of just a rap song. And that song got taken off the charts. There was all kinds of weird controversy. It was the big hit of the summer at that point. Ultimately, congratulations to Tracy Chapman. Now, elsewhere in Saturn News, in the reporting we brought you about Beyond Wonderland a few weeks back, where a man basically opened fire at the campgrounds as the first day of this electronic music festival in Washington was happening. The shooter, the alleged shooter, James M. Kelly, basically just for little to no reason as far as anyone is aware of yet, allegedly pulled out a gun, opened fire, and two people were ultimately murdered as a result of the shooting. 29-year-old Brandy Escamilla and 26-year-old Jocelyn Ruiz. Now, the only real new piece of news here is that James M. Kelly, who is an active U.S. Army member, has basically gone and entered a plea of not guilty. He is currently in jail at Grant County Jail. That's all there really is there, but that is important to note. He believes he's not guilty of murder. Okay, we will see what happens as this plays out in court. Elsewhere in the world of games, and as a kind of a funny national story, given the power and the trauma of the Supreme Court for most liberal-minded people in America right now, ultimately, Apple and Epic Games have had a long-standing series of legal fights against each other. Now, if you're not a gamer, this is a little bit in the weeds, but stick with me here. It's worth understanding this because this is another one of those something is kind of settled and right, and now a group is going to the Supreme Court to basically try to adjudicate on their behalf. And of course, the group in this case is one of the biggest companies on planet Earth, and Apple. So essentially, Apple has long had what they call their App Store, where game makers and game creators can basically put things out. And some things are free and some things are for pay. But more common in the world of video games is there's the ability to pay for upgrades, add-ons, new features, new levels, new content, things like that. And right now, Epic has one of the most popular games in the world, and did as of a couple of years ago in the game Fortnite. And effectively, they were very unhappy with the incredibly high royalty that Apple was charging them, even though they were one of the largest, most popular games on all Apple iOS devices. And so essentially they came to the conclusion they didn't want to abide by that, and they started including within their game links and ways to circumvent having to buy those upgrades, as it were, through Apple directly, and thus offering it to the consumer at a much cheaper price because they wouldn't have to pay the large commission that Apple basically wanted to charge. So they did this. Apple got mad. They sued the crap out of each other. They went to court in the Ninth Circuit. And then ultimately, and I want to make sure I got the judge's name right here, Yvonne Gonzalez-Rogers ruled on Epic Games' behalf for the most part, saying it was, antitrust and it was unfair practices that they had to pay such a large fee and couldn't circumvent it. And so basically issued a statement, basically issued a ruling that they didn't have to, and nobody would have to if they wanted to circumvent Apple's circumstances in terms of their commission for these add-on fees and these upgrades and these different fees that you could get by buying in-app purchases, as it's called, that you wouldn't have to. But then on the other hand, because they hadn't breached their contract with Apple, that then they were ordered to pay the 30% commission that they would have had to pay had they not gone off, because they were in protest of Apple. They left the platform and they were running things entirely through their own system. And this was, of course, breach of contract. So they were ordered to pay that. So now what's happened is that Apple is petitioning the Supreme Court because they are not happy with 2021's 9th District ruling. They do not want to have to abide by that. And we'll put it in their terms for you so you can hear exactly how they're framing it. Their statement from their attorneys were the district court issued a sweeping injunction prohibiting Apple from enforcing its anti-steering rules against all developers of iOS apps offered for distribution in the United States, even though the sole named plaintiff, Epic Games Incorporated, did not seek or obtain class certification and did not prove that an injunction running in favor of non-parties was necessary to make it whole. So this is going to mean years and years of protracted legal headlines coming from whether this is or isn't okay, but it's, as just a commentator editorial kind of point, a little bit curious in the least. I mean, Apple's the biggest company almost on the planet. Do they really need that much more money? They still can do in-app purchases. It's not saying it's not possible to happen, but apparently they think they do, or they don't want to play. So there you have it. That's happening. Elsewhere, and I don't have much in the way of reporting, but it's impossible not to mention it because I know a lot of you are thinking about this, watching this, engaging with this. The Bear, which season 2 has basically just come live and it's just become available for people, is massively popular, and everyone everywhere is super, super interested or talking about this show. And this isn't the kind of data I usually like to share. It's not really quite as filled in, so we're going to work to bring you more and more specific data on this in the weeks to come. I'll work with our TV department to get this. But as far as Hulu is concerned, they've seen a 70% increase in the numbers of what people are streaming of that show versus before it came out. So from season 2 to season 1, it's a massive increase, but how is that quantified? A lot of times streaming services are kind of a black box, really not given a ton of information in terms of like what exact quantities those numbers are. Most successful FX show of all time, and obviously probably one of the more popular shows running on any form of television, streaming on demand or whatever right now. But we're going to work to get you some more specific numbers on that to help quantify that a little better. In previous weeks, we talked to you about how strangely, after there's been just a giant, large dogfight in the world of streaming basically platforms, and specifically what was HBO Go, which became HBO Max, which then became Max. Okay, sure, Max. Effectively, HBO, after working so hard to make such great content, in some cases, literally was deciding they're going to start licensing their content to other platforms. This happened with Westworld the other year, and they were bringing that to Fast Networks and everything. Well, even more strangely, considering, their merger with Discovery, how much original content they have, and also how much original content they are making, some of it with the whole James Gunn Warner Brother universe, some of it like a bunch of new Harry Potter content, all kinds of crazy crap happening, including some of the original Discovery properties. But now they've started to license some of their shows back to Netflix, and apparently in aim of continuing to cut costs or trying to bring as much revenue as humanly possible. And so effectively, they are going to be, and they already have brought Insecure, the wonderful Issa Rae show. If you haven't watched that show, it's a great show. It's finished, it's done. And so it's already, all seasons of it are there, but now it is on Netflix. So if you haven't already seen Insecure, stop what you're doing and go watch it. It's a great, really funny and really good story. It's a really great show. But then also, interestingly, coming to Netflix, not yet, but soon, True Blood, Band of Brothers, 6 Feet Under, and The Rock's short-lived vehicle Ballers. So another curious twist in what seemed like it was the hotbed of competition as far as what television in the modern era meant. But, this is another part of that drawback, right? Stories have been coming out of the woodwork about various shows being created, and then like the Grease kind of spin-off, The Rise of the Pink Ladies, which was canceled and now pulled completely away from the platform, not even going to be on the platform. They're apparently so unhappy with its performance. So there's a whole bunch of twists and turns like that. And then Lastly, and in another curious and alleged piece of news, and I don't want to say any of this is for sure because this is according to the reporting that's there. So we've talked to you on Mixdown and somewhat on this show for the last several years since 2021 about the unfortunate shooting of Helena Hutchins on the set of the movie Rust by famed actor Alec Baldwin, when what is an apparent tragic accident and a gun had a live piece of ammo in it and a test, pulled the trigger, and she was in the line of fire, and Helena Hutchins was the cinematographer on the film, died. So there have been several lawsuits that have kind of spurred up about this, several lawsuits, potential criminal lawsuits, several of them pulled back. And one potential form of litigation that is still kind of working its way through the system. It's a really kind of murky state of play in terms of what will and won't happen. There's been a lot of starts and stops, and there was certain civil litigation that Alec Baldwin had with Hutchins' family, which had been settled, and then the promise of the movie still coming out even after all that happened. And effectively, the piece that's kind of remaining was the armorer on set, Hannah Gutierrez-Reed. Now, whenever you have something like this where firearms are being used, there's usually a person who's like the master of that stuff. They're in charge of those weapons and the way those things work, and ultimately how that all comes together. Well, in this case, Gutierrez-Reed has been the subject of all kinds of allegations of, what may or may not have happened and what may or may not have been done that should have been done. And the interesting kind of twist in this, which certainly doesn't look good if it's true, but this is alleged. We don't know what's really true right now. But the prosecutors that are basically investigating this, that are, on behalf of the state, Kari Morrissey, no relation for those of you that are in music, and Jason Lewis, ultimately have filed that allegedly they have a witness who is claiming, this is all alleged, I want to be very, very clear, I'm not saying for sure this happened, but they're saying that allegedly that a witness was aware that Gutierrez-Reed, they alleged that she had a bag of cocaine and then hid it the night of the accident when Hutchins died. And that she allegedly hid it in an attempt to basically not look like she had been up to something or done something bad. Allegedly, this is all what's alleged. And Gutierrez-Reed's attorney has responded back, firing back at this. His name is Jason Bowles, and he said, a secret witness appears 20 months later with no actual corroboration of evidence, and the state won't identify the person. This is a throwback to the secret star chamber prosecutions in England in the 15th century that were abolished. Like everything else with the state's case investigation, it's full of sound and fury, but signifying nothing. We'll continue to bring you more news on this, as this is apparently going to continue to play out. And of course, it's a massive, epic tragedy. It's hard to believe in 2020s that someone could still get shot and murdered as a part of making a piece of fiction, film and television, but there it is, and there's going to be big consequences when those kinds of things happen. So, lastly, to end off today, just for our own, usual weekly editorial comment, just a little story that I wanted to basically kind of examine and look into here. We just had here in the United States, for those of you in the USA, the 4th of July, right, which is supposed to be, at least in its genesis, a celebration of the Declaration of Independence of this country from England, the beginning and the founding of the country. Now, for me, personally, this holidays really never had anything to do with patriotism or the founding of America or even freedom for that matter. I mean, a lot of people talk about America as the pro of America is freedom, the ability to do and say what you want without repercussions, the freedom of the press, the freedom to make those choices as long as you have the money to make those choices, which is, of course, a big part of the problem in America. But as long as you have the money to make those choices, you can do whatever you want. That's never really been what fascinated me about this holiday. Never really cared, to be 100% honest with you. And I'm not even really weighing in on that, like, yay America, not yay America. For me personally, it comes back to my own origins and basically what would happen on this day. Now, of course, a lot of people in a lot of shapes and forms will somewhat half-heartedly, tongue-in-cheek, maybe too, wear red, white, and blue, the colors of the American flag, as a part of this holiday in terms of celebration, whether it's, just regular apparel or a hat or swimwear or things like that. For me and my family, it was kind of a different thing. I grew up in a small town in Connecticut, and there was a big lake in that town called Highland Lake. And basically people lived all around the lake. It wasn't really anything all that unusual. It was just a lake people lived around. And of course, nowadays it's probably a lot more expensive waterfront property anywhere in America. It's a harder to come by commodity than it used to be. But basically, when we were really young, the whole town would go to Highland Lake. Now, it was a relatively small town, maybe 10,000 people, but the town would go up to the lake, and basically everyone that lived there would light off fireworks. So anywhere you stood, you just saw colorful explosions, not really organized by the town, not really anything that ultimately was sanctioned. It just happened. And that's just what people did. And it was all in good fun. And everybody would just go, ooh, and ah, and look at the explosions in the sky. Not the band, the actual explosions in the sky. And effectively, it was always just an incredible visual spectacle, right? A big part of life is you're walking, you're driving, you're walking, you're driving, you're doing things. Maybe you ride a bike, but most of the time you're walking, you're driving. You see things from a ground level. And something that was really like magnificent to me at that age, in that young 5, 6 years old age, was how three-dimensional fireworks made everything look, how wonderful it made everything feel. Beyond what was just that forward-facing look at life, it was everything all over there. Everything felt like much, much more than what it was. It was this way of opening up the world. And it was also a way that, I don't know, people let their hair down. Halloween's always been really special to me for the same reason, right? Like one of the few days of the year where everybody just decides it's okay to be a freak. Be as strange as you possibly can be. Wear fangs, wear makeup, do unusual things. Don't be so judgmental. Be as strange as you possibly can. And I've always loved that holiday for those reasons. I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about that when we come up to October, and we'll have plenty of content about Halloween as we get closer to it. But 4th of July was a comparable event. You know, it wasn't really about Yay America, even though any average fireworks display most people go to in this country will have like John Philip Sousa playing and God Bless America and other crap like that. But for us, it was just you got together and you saw something beautiful. That was really all there was to it. And then in the years that kind of followed, ultimately, there was essentially a tradition. My father would find fireworks, and I say find because I don't know how he found them. I don't know what you did in those days and what was and wasn't legal. But ultimately, we would sit in the backyard, and much of the town, we'd just sit in the backyard of our house, and he would personally kind of put on a little fireworks display for us. And it was about the best thing that ever happened. It was something I looked forward to all year, more than Christmas, more than any presents. You know, as a young kid, that's all I would think about. Christmas, exciting presents. No, for me, it was entirely just being together as a family and making the world seem much more colorful and amazing and impressive. And that carried for me for years, and much to the chagrin of my wife. Ultimately, any piece of an annual 4th of July doesn't have to always be on the 4th, but fireworks. I'm adamant about, I want to be at fireworks. I want to see fireworks. I want to be there for it. Somewhere when I was in college, just basically wanting to do that and not really hanging so much with my mother and father and sister at that point. When you're in college, you're hanging with your friends, you're not really spending as much time with family as you should be. I kind of went to a whole bunch of my friends and, said, hey, who wants to go to Boston? We'll go watch some fireworks. And everyone was like, sure. No one thought twice about it. The incredible thing about that time, we're going back to basically like 1999, I think, was when this was, one of the summers home from college, that ultimately I had no idea where I was going. I had no idea whether there would be fireworks. And you get 6 of us piled into my, Mercury Grand Marquis boat of a terrible car. It was just falling apart, and basically drove there. And in Connecticut, there's, a handful of ways to go to Boston. It's a decent drive to get from Connecticut to Boston. And basically all I knew was the 91 freeway went north, and then probably there would be some kind of freeway that took you to Boston. So the 6 of us listening to cassette tapes, mixtapes that we had made, and the different weird music that I was listening to at the time. Some of it I think might have been Korn, but a lot of it was just, obscure industrial music, which was a big part of what I was listening to at that phase of my life as I was coming into college. And essentially we drove northbound on the 91, and then we drove eastbound on the Massachusetts Turnpike. No idea where we were going. But thankfully the sign said, hey, Boston's this way. So we kept going until we saw exit signs that said Boston. And I mean, it's a little hard to imagine in this world, because who doesn't travel in this phase of existence without some kind of a nav? Who goes into a major metropolitan city in this world that we live in without a navigation system? And ultimately, we got there, no nav, no map, no idea where we were going or why, just did it, got into Boston, and then everyone's like, well, what do we do now? And I'm like, I don't know, let's park and we'll figure it out. So we pulled into the first pay parking lot we found, which I think was $8. That's another relic of the past that it's laughable to think in a major city during a major holiday you could even find parking for $8 anymore. So we parked, and there was a large crowd of people moving through the streets. And ultimately, I just said, let's follow them. I'm assuming they're going to fireworks. And before we knew it, a few blocks later, we were on Boston Harbor, and literally on the bridge over Boston Harbor. And there indeed was where the fireworks going to happen. Somewhere shortly below the bridge to our right was Debbie Reynolds. You have to look that up if you're not familiar with who Debbie Reynolds is, performing. And ultimately, we sat there on the bridge and watched one of the most amazing fireworks displays I've ever seen. And of course, right, because it was like the fireworks display put on by this major city, Boston. And then in the middle of the night, we drove several hours home to Connecticut and to where we lived in Connecticut. And I think at one point, and I might be getting my stories mixed on this one detail, but I think we stopped at a McDonald's in somewhere in the Massachusetts Turnpike, and one of us got a McDonald's lobster sandwich. That's suspect. I mean, that it was a real thing is true, but it wasn't everywhere. But apparently in Massachusetts, they were tinkering with like lobster McDonald's sandwiches. Okay, so that happened. But ultimately, it was still one of the greatest times me and those 5 friends that went with me had, as far as just an unusual, incredible experience. And for me, the nostalgia of those moments and what fireworks might mean, because I'm not like a gunpowder enthusiast, and I'm, not even a person who's ever really lit them off myself. I probably could. It probably wouldn't be very hard if I wanted to, but just to be a part of that experience and to share that and to be with people I love at that time, heartbeat of my year in some respects. It's an interesting thing in the ecosystem that we live in, and there's a lot of very legitimate challenges socially, politically. There's a lot of things that are changing in our country, and a lot of things that, quite frankly, needed to change that haven't been changing in a very long time. What's interesting for me, and I don't want to wade hip deep into some of the politics of this because that's not the point of this show. That's not the point of what Mixdown does. But what's interesting about what I've seen this week was how many people are just going out of their way to bag on the holiday, the origins of America, perceived slights, and things like that. And, it's fine. You don't have to be happy about everything that went into this country's founding. And I mean, most countries in their founding don't have a great origin story. There's a lot of blood and violence behind a lot of countries on this planet, somewhere in their history, if not in their origin. It's a difficult and, rough thing. And it's not necessarily always a happy thought. And once again, never have I been in my life, and nor would I say now that I'm some militant flag waving, like, yay America person, not really weighing in on that as far as a political party or any affiliation or anything like that. But, ultimately, it's interesting to me that such a busy, stressful world, so much work to do, so many things you have to do in this world to get by, to make things work, and nothing is easy anymore. Whatever halcyon notion of like simplicity that people had is long lost to a muddle of confusion and information and headlines and difficulties and bills and overcharge charges and a whole bunch of shit that is just frankly incredibly frustrating. And yet, in a time like this, every spare moment seems precious. Any chance to be just not doing that seems like a gift from the gods, or God, or no gods, whatever you choose to believe. It's a gift to have any chance to just sit there and reflect, just to breathe in, catch your breath, find who you are in this world, just to be centered for a moment. And it's interesting to me, and this is kind of why I wanted to go down this road and this little bit of nostalgia, with so many difficulties, with so many challenges, to have an arena where, with even a gift like that, whatever its origins were, right? Whatever there was about it that might have been complicated or perhaps not quite as clean and, looking okay by modern standards, still, there's something in it that has merit. What I think I'm digging into here is that kind of chosen notion of, selective outrage, or perhaps even just an inability to be able to look at things and go, well, nothing's ever really perfect, but what can we take from this that's actually useful? What can we take from this that is helpful? Now, on a very basic level, I'm just making the same argument that Chris Rock did eons ago when people were complaining about Martin Luther King Day. You know, his complaint was to racists who hated the fact that there was Martin Luther King Day was, you don't have to celebrate Dr. King. You just got to not work. And who wants to, you know, work if they don't have to? Who, if you have a chance to just be on holiday, that you wouldn't. But I think there's also that connection where it comes down to a measure of, you know, there's so many things about anything that you could look at, you know, like a dodecahedron, like an amorphous object, and look at anything a certain way, you're going to find something bad about it. But then that kind of inability, unwillingness to kind of see something in terms of what's good. And I'm not trying to be an apologist for the horrors of our country's past. Believe me, I forgive nothing in that respect. Certainly, there's tons of stuff that there still are systemic problems coming from and things that are still being addressed. I'm not trying to make an argument in defense of anything of that time or what standards were, only to say that everything kind of is what it is when it is, and things evolve in the way that it evolves as time goes on. But here we are now, armed with what do we have to do with our precious time on this planet? And what's interesting about this moment, at least what I feel, doesn't mean I'm taking a poll or that I have like nationwide data on this, is people's reticence to be able to be comfortable or happy with the positive aspects of something and the aim of trying to breathe more life into that. How can we make things better? How can we have a constructive dialogue? How can we do things to improve the way things are? And as difficult and terrible as so many things have been these last 3-4 years, there's also so much that could be so much worse. It is the conceit of a narrow-minded person to think that nothing matters and nothing has improved in any respect. Are things what they should be? Hell no. Of course not. Tons of room for improvement. But on some level, there's a whole lot about everything in reality that is still way better than it was 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago. Ultimately, all that I'm making the case for is trying to see within something, where are the merits in this thing? And how can that be a part of, you know, minimizing the flaws of something and maximizing the strengths? How do we take something like this and make something better from it? How do we take those lessons from the past, the pieces that were useful at least, and use this to build a better tomorrow? Because really, on some level, whatever did happen and what other things might have been done or mistakes that might have been made, they're done. There's nothing to change what happened. So we can sit here overanalyzing those tenets and those pieces, those things that didn't go well. Or we can look to the future and say, how can we do this better? How can we find a better way to make things more fair, to make things more fun, to make things more easy? I mean, wouldn't we all like that? Wouldn't just more easy be sufficient? Isn't shit hard enough? And that's where I think time and attention is best spent. So I'm splitting hairs with people who are splitting hairs just in terms of glass half full, glass, you know, half empty thinking. There's always a way to try to find a problem with something, but the harder thing to do is to look at things and say, how can this be better? That's all for episode 33 of This Week is Live. Thanks again for everyone for joining us, wherever you're joining us. And as this experiment works, some of you probably saw this on Tumblr as we were broadcasting it. Some of you probably saw this on Instagram. And those of you watching on Twitch or chatting here on Twitch, thank you to everyone who joins us. And of course, anyone who engages with this content, any of the other places that we post it, the social media clips that we run after the fact in Facebook and Twitter and in YouTube shorts, but then also when we rebroadcast this show and post it on our YouTube channel. Thanks to everyone who engages with wherever you engage with our content. Please join us here every week. On Twitch, preferably if you can. We broadcast roughly around 5:30 p.m. Pacific, sometimes 6 o'clock. And then ultimately, if you don't already, follow us on YouTube, subscribe to us on Twitch. Please join us again each and every week. We'll be back here next week with more headlines and more stories and all kinds of surprises to come. I promise. So thanks again for joining us. So glad to see you well.